It is so important when dealing with the healthcare system to understand and feel comfortable with your healthcare team, but to always remember that you yourself are the most important person in your healthcare team. You need to be paying attention to your body and trusting your intuition and not being afraid to ask questions about your treatment or the testing that you're being given. Trust yourself and advocate for yourself. It's the most important thing you can do as you're being treated for breast cancer.
Welcome to Women Leaders on the Move. I'm your host, Natalie Benamou, and every week I bring you inspirational stories and ideas to help you with the arc of your career and your life. I'm also the founder of Her C-Suite, where ambitious women come together, meet, engage, and thrive in meaningful ways on our network platform, in our programs, and also at our events. I hope you will visit us at hercsuite.com. And I'm also the president of Her Health X, a new nonprofit focused on improving health outcomes for women. And this show is a special Her Health X show focused on ways for you to know how to improve your health outcomes as it relates to scans. And I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation with Pam Cole. She's had 40 years of experience working in government and nonprofit management. She served as executive director of the Susan G. Komen, North Carolina Triangle to the Coast affiliate, which serves 29 counties in North Carolina. In that role, she was a passionate spokesperson and advocate for equitable breast cancer support services in Eastern North Carolina and a vital need for breast cancer research. Her passion for finding the treatments and cures for metastatic breast cancer led to the development of the new Komen Metastatic Breast Cancer Collaborative Research Initiative, which she currently directs. Pam was diagnosed first with stage 1 ER-positive breast cancer in 2009. She had a lumpectomy, radiation, and stayed on her endocrine therapy for 5 years. We're going to be talking about all the details of that treatment in this conversation and how her life changed, unfortunately, due to changes in her health, which led to metastatic breast cancer and the gaslighting that she experienced in not getting the right treatment and continuing her course of care. I know that you will learn a lot about PET scans and all of the information. I will have resources in the show notes. Please check that out. And with that, let's get started with this important conversation with Pam now. Pam, I'm so excited to welcome you to Women Leaders on the Move. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you.
We connected through some shared interesting connections through our health journeys. But before we get started on that story and the arc of that, I would love for you to share a little bit about you so our audience can get to know you and about your career and how we're arriving today together.
Okay, well, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, have been born and raised here, lived in Greensboro and then moved to Raleigh and have been here ever since. I'm married with 2 children, a 24-year-old son who just got engaged, so we're very excited about that. And my 30-year-old daughter, they both live in Durham, so I know how lucky I am to have them close by. And I've been in the government or not-for-profit sector my entire career, have been the executive director of 3 health-related nonprofits, worked as district director for a congressman for 10 years. I'm retired now. I finished my career at Susan G. Komen. I was the executive director for 10 years, but then moved into a new role. I created a metastatic breast cancer collaborative research initiative where I raised $2 million to fund collaborative metastatic breast cancer research between Duke and the University of North Carolina. who are fierce rivals. But I just knew they were both doing some amazing work on breast cancer research. And it just seemed to me that we needed to find a way to incentivize them to work together to find the cures. And all it took was some money, and we funded four $500,000 collaborative research grants.
Amazing. That's incredible. And I know for our listeners, it's interesting. You were at Susan B. Komen because you also had your own personal journey with cancer and are still having that journey. Can you talk a little bit about that? And obviously, that has played a part in your experiences and how we came together today.
Yes, I had an early stage breast cancer in 2010 with stage one, less than a centimeter, no lymph node involvement, had radiation, lumpectomy, and 5 years of endocrine therapy, which I was told at that point that I was cured from breast cancer. And then 3 years later, during my annual mammogram, there was something suspicious in the same area of the original breast cancer. And I'm not going to go through the whole gruesome story, but after ultrasound and biopsy, was discovered that it was a recurrence of my breast cancer. I had a mastectomy and was going to just go back on endocrine therapy. But after being a fierce advocate for myself and asking for a PET scan just to make sure everything was okay, it was discovered that I had stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and two lymph nodes near my lungs had metastatic breast cancer. And that was 7 years ago. Although I was told at the time that I probably had 2 to 3 years, thanks to research and personalized treatment that we now have a lot more of. Still in treatment. I'll be in treatment the rest of my life. Breast cancer is fierce and tenacious and so darn smart, and it learns its way around the treatments. So all the treatments will ultimately fail. And our goal at this point is just to stay on a treatment as long as we can and get on the next treatment, and to just keep hoping that research will provide more and more treatments for us.
And I want to just touch a little bit on that change because you were diagnosed, and we talked about this before this podcast, and that's how we came together. But you were diagnosed, and you knew that 5 years should be longer because of the where you worked. Can
Right.
you describe a little bit about that? Because that is really the thing that lights me up when I hear these stories, and why I'm so fierce to want to make a change is because of stories like yours. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that experience, because I'm sure there's women listening that are nodding their heads and saying, yes, and I've got a story too. So I'd like you to share that because you knew about things and still.
Yeah, so I say all the time that, working at Komen, the good news is I know a lot, and the bad news is I know a lot. So I knew that a study was coming out saying that women with ER positive breast cancer, most women, not all, should keep on their endocrine therapy for 10 years instead of 5 years. That we now know that breast cancer can recur and or become metastatic 10, 15, 20 years later. And again, I'm focused on ER positive breast cancer. There are different types of breast cancer. And when I asked my oncologist at that time, really, you're telling me I can go off endocrine therapy? It's my understanding that we should be staying on it longer. And he said, oh, no, no, you're fine. You can look breast cancer in your rearview mirror. You're cured. And you know what? We all want to hear that. And even though I worked at Komen and I knew lots of women, I wanted to hear that, right? I was early stage. So I did great for 3 years and then went for the mammography, and then that whole cycle started again. But even when I asked for the PET scan, they kept saying I didn't need a PET scan. I didn't need a PET scan, that I was fine, not fine, but that I was just going to be back on endocrine therapy for 5 years. But when my radiation oncologist called and said, she was 95% certain that after this mastectomy, I did not need radiation again, she wanted to take it to the tumor board. And at that point, I just became fierce again and said, look, if we're going to the tumor board, I want all the information. We need that. And she again said no, and I didn't need it. And I said, look, I don't think I need it. I think I'm fine. But if I'm back here again in 5 years, don't we want a baseline of information? And she finally relented and said she would try to get insurance to cover it, which they did, and had the PET scan. And it showed two suspicious areas, and they had to be biopsied. And when the biopsies that afternoon, as I tell the story, they had to put me to sleep because of where it was. And I was in the outpatient waiting room to recovery room so that we could leave that evening. It was 6:30 at night. And my husband and I were sitting there, and my oncologist and my radiation oncologist were both coming toward my room at 6:30 at night. And I looked at my husband and said, this is not going to be a good conversation. So one of the important lessons in all of this is that there's nobody more important to your healthcare than yourself. And you absolutely need to trust your instincts. And it is really hard. Even strong, powerful women, when they get that gown on, we want to hear the good stuff, and we don't want to make our doctor mad. We want to be the favorite patient. All of those things make it difficult for us to advocate for ourselves. And I tell women now all the time, if you've ever been diagnosed with breast cancer, there is a 30% chance that you're going to have a recurrence and or become metastatic. So take yourself seriously. Don't think you're crazy. Don't let anybody in the healthcare system gaslight you. And I say, if you feel something, say something. Do not be dismissed. If you have pain, even if it was 10 years ago when you had your first breast cancer, if you have pain that you cannot explain and it lasts for 2 weeks, call your oncologist, not your GP. Call your oncologist and make sure that they do the tests that are needed to find out where that pain is coming from. I don't want to scare people. It's a fine line because most women with breast cancer do fine, but trust your instincts and trust your body. Don't be afraid to ask when you feel something.
We've been talking about some of the tests, and I'd love for you to walk through a little bit about those tests because I know what they are, but some of our listeners may not. And then when they go to the doctor, they may not know what to ask for. So we've been talking about the PET scan. Let's start with that and talk about why that's so important and what does it test for. And so when you're having that conversation, you can be armed with that knowledge to say, well, I know that this shows that.
And I need to put out there, I'm not a doctor. So understand that this is just my personal experience and my experience working at Komen for 10 years and dealing with a lot of breast cancer. So normally you just go get your mammogram. If something suspicious comes up, you do an ultrasound. Then you do the biopsy, and that the biopsy is the critical thing at that point. And the biopsy is going to say whether it's cancer, but also if it's breast cancer, it's going to be able to tell whether it's estrogen positive, HER2 positive, triple negative. And that's critically important because that's going to drive your treatment depending on what type of breast cancer you have. So you're going to go through treatment. Hopefully everything's going to be fine after you have your radiation or chemo or whatever you have. But once you have a recurrence, they really need to make sure that it is just a recurrence. So they might suggest that you have a CT scan, a bone scan, and or a PET scan. Now, when I was first diagnosed with the recurrence, they didn't do any of that. It was ER positive. It was in the same place. They just assumed it was the same breast cancer and just a recurrence. But I think now they're being smarter about that. But if they aren't, if you have a recurrence, ask for all three or at least the CT and bone scan. Some insurance pays for PET scans, Medicare, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so once you're diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, again, it will depend on what type of breast cancer it is, what your first line of treatment will be. But they are going to actively, aggressively pay attention and surveil you, right? And normally that would be PET scan, CT, bone scan every 3 months. Now, Medicare, for example, won't pay for PET scans like that. So I get a CT scan and a bone scan every 3 months. And these scans are critically important because the scans will show whether your MBC, metastatic breast cancer, is progressing. And if it is, then you will need to change your treatment. So the scans are an important part of your treatment. I've had progression 4 times now, and each time it has meant that I've either needed to tweak my treatment or do some radiation. I've had cryoablation. We've been aggressively treating every new tumor or every new met. I've had to change my systemic treatment. We would not have known to do that without these scans because, again, the breast cancer, when it becomes metastatic, is so smart, it morphs. So just because I was ER positive initially doesn't mean that I'm going to stay ER positive. And if they're treating me for ER positive, it doesn't work anymore. So the scans are so important that they are for those of us, anybody who's living with metastatic cancer. First of all, for diagnosis, obviously, but secondly, to monitor your progress with your cancer. And so one of the things that's really important about these scans is that a bone scan and a PET scan, they use radiopharmaceutical tracers, right? Not with a CT scan, they use a different kind of contrast. And so they do that with an IV, right? They inject the dye or the radiopharmaceutical, or what I call the juice, into your vein. And, it's very sensitive. It depends on your weight and, to get the exact, I'm not a chemist, so the absolute exact amount of juice that will give them the right pictures. And what this juice does, a normal average PET scan, is it's seeking sugar because cancer is dependent on sugar. And so it's going to look where there's a lot of activity, which is a tumor. And that's what lights up. You've seen pictures. Well, if you don't have the right amount of juice in this PET scan, then you're not going to get an accurate reading of whether you have a tumor, how large it is, and whether it's currently active. And so what can happen, and especially when you are getting these kinds of tests every month or are on chemo and getting lots of IVs, you can have what's called an extravasation, where the juice leaks out of the vein or the injection wasn't accurate, and so it pokes through. The juice gets into your tissue and not in your vein. And this is dangerous because it can damage the tissue. It's radioactive material, but also it means you're not getting an accurate scan, and your treatment is dependent on those accurate scans. And many times this extravasation, as a patient, you may not even know that it's happening. Sometimes you do know. In a situation where I was extravasated, definitely didn't feel right, burning a little bit, which it doesn't usually. And I kept saying to the technician, I think something's wrong. And she kept saying, no, I got blood return, everything's fine. And I said, I think I've had an extravasation because, again, I knew about this. And she was very certain that I hadn't. But again, I found my personal strength, power, whatever. I said, I want you to put my arm under an x-ray machine or something to see. And sure enough, the juice was one big blob in my arm. So I was definitely extravasated. They did nothing to mitigate. They didn't put warm compresses, didn't do any kind of massage. So here's the thing that's so frustrating to me as a patient. There's nothing required about when extravasation happens. So at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, guidelines for nuclear medicine have not been updated since I think 1982. So an extravasation does not have to be reported to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to the hospital radiology department, or to my oncologist. However, if a little drop of that juice happened to fall on the sleeve of my gown or on the outside of my skin, a tiny little drop, that has to be reported to everybody. But if it extravasates out of my vein into my body, it does not. And that's outrageous. And it's so frustrating because extravasations are an issue that is completely solvable. It requires constant quality control, retraining, the use. There's now they have ultrasound, portable ultrasound machines that can help the technician find the right vein, help find the right size of the needle. And there's also tools where they can put a tool on your arm while you're being injected to see if the radiopharmaceutical is actually going in your vein at the right time, at the right size. It is a completely solvable problem. Plus, we as patients deserve to know that kind of accountability. The hospital needs to know. I would like to be able to look up a center where I'm going to go have a scan and see how they do with extravasations. There needs to be patient transparency so that we know whether we need a new scan, so our doctor knows whether we need a new scan. And you can tell I'm passionate about this, as are many of us who are getting these scans every 3 months. We have enough anxiety living with MBC to not have to have anxiety about whether our scans are accurate or not. Those are the important things.
Yeah, well, I think when you and I started talking about this, we're planning for an event. So this podcast is coming out right before our event. So we'll be promoting that at the end. But when we met, without my knowledge, I had just had one of these scans, but for my heart. So I don't have breast cancer, but I definitely have heart disease and I have to be fairly vigilant. So I went for this nuclear medicine test and I had no idea. I just went, gave him my arm, put the stuff in, went and had the test. I lucked out. I really believe this. I really did luck out that I didn't have anything happen. But afterwards, I was like, I had no idea as a patient. So it really transcends across all tests for all patients that this is really highly dangerous. If you think about it, this is a radioactive material that needs to go in your vein. And if it doesn't, it can do major damage. And I definitely want to hear about the new PET scan. I want to talk about that because I don't think people realize the extent that tissue damage that can happen in this case and how frequent it can happen.
Right. And what if I had a newborn baby, right? And this extravasation was right in my elbow, in the fold of my elbow, right? If I'm holding my baby, breastfeeding, or feeding my baby, is the fact that I've got all this nuclear medicine in that arm. We don't know those kinds of things. And that's why it's so important that it be regulated and that it be reported so that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can make certain that institutions are adequately training their technicians, but also mitigating when it does happen. There are things you can do to make it so that it's not sitting there. And we have gotten legislation, bipartisan legislation, introduced that would require patient transparency about nuclear injections. It's House Bill 6815. House Bill 6815. And so write your congressperson and ask them to support this bill that would require more patient safety. It reminds me of quite a while back when women came together and fought for mammography machines to be regularly calibrated because they do lose some of their calibration, I guess. And so now it's required that mammography centers calibrate their machines every 2 years, I think it is. And it has saved women's lives because they're getting accurate mammograms. And it took years for women to fight the fight to get this to happen. And there's transparency now. You can look up and see when the last time the machines were calibrated. And if there has been something wrong, then the center has to send a letter to women who have had mammograms there. That happened to a lot of women in Raleigh 2 years ago when one of the centers discovered that one of their machines was not calibrated correctly. They had to send letters to women to come get second mammograms.
That's so scary. It's like you think you're going for your test. It's not a pleasant test. I mean, that test does not feel great. And then some of the other tests and getting that nuclear medicine is not feel good either, really. I mean, you're going through, you have to wait and then you go in and then you have to wait. I mean, there's all this stuff going on with this. I mean, that's what happened to me, but I imagine it's similar.
Absolutely.
It's time out of your day. It's time out of maybe someone who's driving you, because I didn't go alone. I didn't know what to expect. I had my husband drive me. So there's all those factors. And then to be told, like, well, you got to come back. You got to come back. And then the fear comes in your mind of like, well, I mean, I'm sure it's fine, but I got to go back. And then you start thinking about things, even though that's not why you're going back. I'm sure there's women that worry, right? That are like, why do I have to go back? So all of that is time that is lost, all because of these simple things that can be done. I will absolutely have the information in the show notes about who to write to, how do you write to your congressperson. You should be writing, and this bill should be passed. It's so simple. We're not asking for something really complicated and crazy. This is just common sense.
Right.
Protocols, right?
Right. Standard of care protocol.
Standard of care. Exactly.
And
Yes.
so we started an organization called Patients for Safe Nuclear Medicine. Hope you'll put the website up. Lots of information on there about how to write your there's even a link that you can just push to write your congressperson, but also just other information, data that we have, how often these things happen, and why it's so important for institutions to be transparent. This is an important part of healthcare now, even more important than it used to be, because there's so much more personalized medicine now, which is amazing. That your breast cancer is not going to be treated the same way my breast cancer is being treated, where it used to be all of us had to have the same treatment at the highest levels of chemo. That's not true anymore. And it's these scans and these tests are part of the reason that we know this now and that we can provide that precision medicine.
And you said that there's a new scan. Can you talk about that? There's a new...
Yeah, it's still part of a radiopharma. I mean, it's still used with a radiopharmaceutical, but there's a new part of the juice. You can see, I don't know what I'm talking about scientifically, that can find estrogen positive breast cancer. And that's all it does. And so this is brand new, and it's amazing because the last time I had progression, some new mets in January, I was able to get what's called the F as in Frank, ES, or the cerulean PET scan, so that I didn't have to have invasive biopsies of these tumors. And it was able to go and find the new tumors and show how estrogen positive, if they were estrogen positive, how estrogen positive. And then if I had other tumors and it didn't light up, then it meant that it wasn't estrogen positive. Fortunately, they were all estrogen positive. So we were able to continue at least part of my treatment. But this is a whole new, wonderful way that is so much better for patients than having to have sometimes risky biopsies. And sometimes your tumor may be somewhere where it can't be biopsied. And then you're really treated with a blindfold on. And, it's just one example. There's research going on all over about, are there other ways to find other types of cancers through these kinds of injections and through these scans. So it's a great thing. If they have any question about something, ask your physician about the cerulean PET scan or the FES PET scan. Now, right now, some insurance is covering it, some is not, but you can still try to find out more about it.
Well, we'll have all of that information in the notes. And it has been just so, I always learn more every time I talk to you. And we are going to have an event where people can get to see you on camera and interact and ask questions. So I want to encourage our listeners to come to our event in October. We'll have the date for the event in the notes as well. And we want you to sign up and join us in October for this event. And I can't wait to have that conversation with you. And it's always a pleasure and a delight to see you. So thank you for being on the show today, Pam. It's been great.
You're doing such good work. Thank you.
Thank you for spending your time with us today. Her Health X is a new nonprofit focused on improving health outcomes by quantifying the cost of medical gaslighting. We are working with organizations to identify and have a research protocol to do the research on the ripple effects that things like the situation that we talked about today has on an individual, on her family, and on the community at large when things are not diagnosed properly. If a situation happens like we talked about today with extravasation, that the impact can have long-lasting effects. I hope you'll visit us at herhealthx.org. Keep shining your light bright. The world needs you.